Welcome to Politifest 2024. I know a few of us have been here for a while, but the topic today is Can Our Government Meet the Moment? I'm Lisa Halberstadt, and I'm a reporter at Voice of San Diego. It's great to be here with you today. In case you're not familiar with us, Voice of San Diego is a nonprofit investigative news outlet. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so used to projecting. Grew up in a big Catholic family, so I can really project and not know that I'm not mic'd. Okay, so again, in case you're not familiar with us, Voice of San Diego is a nonprofit investigative news outlet committed to holding public officials accountable and giving you, the public, the information you need to be advocates for good government. As a nonprofit, we depend on members, donors, and sponsors like you to make our work possible. Thank you for your support. I'd like to take a minute to recognize our sponsors who help make Politifest possible. A special thanks to the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of San Diego for being our partner for a 7th year. Our special thanks also to the Sequan Band of the Kumeyaay Nation, the United Domestic Workers Union, AARP, the San Diego Foundation, Business for Good, Hitsky Development, the San Diego Municipal Employees Association, the Asian Business Association, Planned Parenthood of the Pacific Southwest, the Atlantis Group, and the Southern California Rental Housing Association, also San Diego Art Matters. We'd also like to recognize KPBS and iNewsSource, our partners in Public Matters. We are partnering to share content, conversation, and events like Politifest to ensure all San Diegans understand their opportunity to participate in the democratic process, and that it means more than voting in an election. If you're unable to attend any of the sessions in person, don't worry. We'll be posting the recordings to the Politifest page of our website next week. We welcome your questions. Just write your question clearly on a note card. They're in the back, and the volunteers and I will be walking around to distribute note cards. And we will collect those cards and pass them to Bella, and she'll try to answer as many as she can. You can tweet along with the session and share your experience by using hashtag Politifest2024 on social media and tag us on Instagram and Facebook. Now, allow me, actually, before we introduce Bella, a special thanks to AARP for sponsoring this session. Please welcome Joe Garbanzo's AARP California State President to say a few words about the organization.
Buenas tardes, buenos dias, good afternoon to you all. Let me see if I can place this where you can hear me. Is that better? Terrific. So firstly, I'd like to recognize AARP staff and volunteers who are in the room. Thank you for your service, so let's give them a hand. So AARP is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization. We have about 30 million members nationwide, so we have a large footprint. Here in San Diego, I believe we have about, 250, about 3 million in the state, 250 are residents of San Diego County. So we are the voice of a large group here. So AARP is a major stakeholder in the topic that this panel will be covering this afternoon. But we have a conviction that the shifting demographics, getting older, and communities anticipating the challenges and opportunities. Oh, sorry. I'm a klutz. So, right, thank you. Yeah,
You can keep talking.
Okay, keep on talking. So, we are a major stakeholder, in the issue of aging, the changing demographics, and what's happening in the community. You all have heard the statistics of this surge of baby boomers, retiring. I think it's 11,000 everyday baby boomers are retiring. And that is a monumental shift in demographics. There's a saying, demography is destiny, right? So this is something that can be a plus or a minus in terms of the future. And the future is hard to predict, right? Hard to predict. You can only shape the future by what you do, perhaps in terms of policies, education, in a daily basis. There's some bright spots, though, in the midst of all this concern about the future with the changing demographics. Bright spots are happening in the communities where you live. we reside in a jurisdiction or a county where many of our communities are part of the livable network of communities. These are age-friendly communities belonging to a network of communities in the state as well as in the nation. And these are communities that are intentionally creating policies that will enable not only older adults, but across ages to live with confidence and with ease in their communities. So I think the topic here this afternoon is along those lines, right? How can government play a role in terms of preparing for the future in enabling communities to be more livable? Very challenging topic. So we are privileged to be part of this conversation here this afternoon, and the panel is a challenge to you. Let's challenge the panelists to provide our audience here with some key takeaways on what they can do individually, perhaps as a group, to make our communities more livable. So thank you very much for having us here, and looking forward to the discussion from our panelists.
And now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Bella Ross, social media producer for Voice of San Diego.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for being here today. I'm going to take a couple of minutes just to go over some facts and figures that I don't think will be surprising to anybody. Warning, depressing. But basically, the reason I wanted to have this conversation is, I am a young person. I care a lot about making San Diego a place that people like myself and everybody in this room can actually build a future. And the affordability crisis, I think, is making that extremely difficult to envision. So let's talk about that. The cost of living in San Diego is significantly higher than other places, and statistics do show that it is causing people to either leave the state or consider leaving the state. So we know that that's a thing. There are other factors that are inspiring these choices, such as politics and just like personal choices, but housing costs, cost of food, all of that stuff is really pushing people out of the state. And in San Diego, I think we have it a lot worse than some of the other areas of the state. So that's really interesting. And I also, I don't know, I was thinking about this, but I'm kind of used to hearing like boomers and older generations say that, you can just work harder and nobody wants to work anymore. But the rate of inflation that we're seeing is just so far outpacing the, inflation of salaries. And I'm sure a lot of us know that, but I feel the need to emphasize. And so getting into that, housing costs versus income. Average monthly rent just shy of $3,000 a month. Can't really get a house for less than $1 million. And the minimum wage, there is a proposition to increase the minimum wage, and that's what's happening, but it's still far below what would be considered a livable wage in San Diego with the situation we have now. And I spent some time with the SANDAG's 2050 regional forecast. Obviously, the theme today is can the government meet the moment? The moment is 2024. It's not 2050. But we really do need to, I think, so much of our success as a community is contingent, and in the future is contingent on the things that we do now. This stuff does not happen overnight. And as was just talked about, the senior population will be increasing significantly, so we're seeing these changes in demographics that really change the housing needs of our communities and the labor dynamics. The population growth is not necessarily expected to decline just based off of these forecasts, but it is slowing, and that population is kind of moving to other parts of the county. But it does not necessarily mean that our housing needs will be decreased. And I'm going to leave us with this beautiful graph that shows forecasted housing growth and forecasted population growth. So we're still missing the mark. Maybe we could change that. We're going to get into it. But I want to introduce some of our panelists first. We have Dr. Mounah Abdel-Samad, Associate Professor from SDSU and the Public Affairs Department. We have Saad Asad from the Yimby Democrats of San Diego. Brisa Johnson, Director of the San Diego Black Workers Center, and Ray Major, former Deputy CEO of Sandag. And I want to start with you, Ray. You were the demographics guy at Sandag, and I wonder if you could just kind of paint a picture of, what are we facing in these next couple of decades that we really need to start preparing for, like in terms of demographic changes?
So, thank you. The numbers that you put up there are not only accurate, but it's a little bit startling because this is the first time that Sandag has ever done a forecast where the population isn't growing by hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people over the next couple of decades. So we've always been planning for growth. And the numbers that Bella shared took us out to 2050. And that's used for the regional plan, but that forecast actually went out to 2060. Our long-term forecast now goes out that far. And that does show that there starts to become a decrease in population. And it's basically because those baby boomers start to age out of the population. It's a nice way of saying it, start dying. But the problem that we have in terms of housing is that we're about 100,000 units short right now. In terms of housing units, we have about 1.3 million housing units in the San Diego region. We need about 100,000 more to take the excess demand and let everyone who needs that or would want to have a house have a house. The problem is that the policies that are working or are being implemented right now are really not moving the needle very quickly on creating additional housing. And the housing that it does create is $1 million units, and that makes that is unaffordable not only to people making minimum wage, but people making the average salary in San Diego. So if you looked at what the mortgage interest rates were during COVID, we were looking at an average mortgage. People were paying about $2,600, so that was less than what the rent is now. Okay, this is right before 2019. It was October when we kind of started thinking about shutting down. Now that average mortgage is over $4,600, and that's because of interest rates. And so the cost of housing is literally double. And then you add the other things like the cost of electricity, et cetera, on top of that, which is what you were talking about. And it makes San Diego the most unaffordable area in the entire nation because our incomes are typically lower. And that's because we don't have an economic base that really creates a lot of high-paying jobs. What we have is a base of moderate-paying jobs. So we have a big tourism industry, it's low-paying, a big military industry, that's kind of low-paying too when it comes right down to it. And then we have high-tech, which is high. There are high-wage jobs in high-tech, but it can't carry the entire region. So just a little bit of a synopsis of what might be happening. The other thing, the aging of the population, let me just cover that one point and I'll turn it back. Although 1 in 5 people by 2050 will be age 65 plus, by 2060 that's almost a third of the population will be age 65 plus. And that looks much more like a retirement community in Florida than a high-tech community like we have now. And so how we plan for housing in the future is incredibly important because by the time we build these units out, our entire population will be 10 to 20 years older. So think of it that way when you think of this problem.
So I want to get a little bit more into the housing thing, but a follow-up for you is, how is it possible that we have been preparing for growth for like however many decades now, thinking about housing, and we're still like so extremely behind, even looking forward to a future where we're having less population growth, like we're still going to be behind. Like what is astray?
Well, there's housing problems throughout the entire nation, right? So there's a problem there. Construction costs have gone up extremely high. I mean, you can't, even if you're trying to build an ADU, people can't figure out how to make that pencil. That's one of the problems, even though the laws have been changed to allow ADUs to be built. But one of the things that you have is you have contradictory laws that are coming from different areas that really impact housing. Like, for instance, one of the goals is to reduce vehicle miles traveled and to densify the urban core. Okay, that's a goal. And if you want to do that, then what you're doing is you're excluding a lot of the land in the San Diego region, probably 3/4 of it or more, from development. And so you're taking the highest priced land, which is on the coastal areas, and saying we need to densify the highest priced areas even more. And so that's why you're only being able to build these type of units. If you think about, so there's a lot of laws that have come from, and a lot of them are state laws for transportation reasons. And I'm not saying that they're wrong or right, but they're impacting our ability to build housing in the numbers that we need. 100,000 housing units is an incredible amount. That's talking about like building the city of Encinitas, Carlsbad, Del Mar, and Chula Vista all at the same time. All those housing units you have to build in order to get the number of housing units that we need.
Right, so I want to jump over to Saad about this. We're talking about the future of San Diego, and the future of San Diego also concerns the climate of the future, which is so much of the conversation with vehicle miles traveled, and just balancing these different needs, these housing needs and these climate needs. And I'm wondering, Saad, how do we factor that into solutions, striking that balance when it comes to developing more housing?
It's not easy. I think Ray is 100% right in that it's hard to balance two needs, and that if you were to build more housing out in East County, it would likely be a bit more affordable, but the transportation costs will of course be higher. Those people will not have any jobs out in East County. They'll be driving into Carlsbad, Kearny Mesa, University City, and that naturally causes a lot of gridlock. And then down the road, that means you have to build out infrastructure, more highways to support those communities as well. So it is a hard balance to have both climate concerns taken into account and affordability. However, I think there is a way to still focus our growth on our urban communities where our jobs and schools are. And speaking of affordability, it's how we sort of propel lower and middle class groups is not to push them out into East County where they have larger commutes, more time away from their families, but closer to the jobs and schools that allow them to have the mobility to achieve higher paying jobs. There's no easy answer, but the way to achieve both climate goals and try to meet our housing goals is to focus our housing in the communities that are already built up. There's going to be costs associated with that, so we need to find ways to reduce those costs. So that means more housing on a smaller amount of land, reducing some of the barriers, the permitting time, things that just slow the speed of housing. As you delay more housing, it eventually just deny people the housing if you're not ever building it.
And so how do we make sure, as a kind of a follow-up to that, so much of this housing that we're seeing coming up, as we talk about, we've already talked about this in so many panels today, but is extremely unaffordable. So how do we make sure that all of these efforts that we're putting into planning for our future are supporting the people who need the support the most when it comes to housing?
Yeah, so we do need to support both, we need to have housing options for all income levels. So it still helps to have housing that is expensive because it sort of absorbs all those wealthy folks who normally would then start competing for older apartments. So it's still helpful to have these high rises go up because then those professionals that do work in biotech and high tech will then be able to take those housing options instead of competing with middle class people for older apartments. With that said, we 100% need more affordable housing construction, and that needs to come, it's a money problem in that way too, and that needs to come from both the federal, state, and local level. There's a presidential candidate that has proposed, actually I'm having me down here, yeah, I can say. Vice President Harris has proposed expanding the low-income housing tax credit, which would have huge implications for the amount of affordable housing that could be built. At the state level, there's a proposition called Prop 5, which would lower the threshold to allow for us to vote on affordable housing. A few years ago, I think San Diegans voted for an affordable housing bond, and only 64% supported it, and it needed to be at 66%. This lowers the threshold to 55%. So now we can actually have a stream of revenue to support the building of affordable housing locally. So there does need to be money involved. That needs to come here. But we also just need to reduce the costs, and that means allowing for these ADUs, allowing for housing to be on smaller plots of land, allowing housing in different ways of being built, mass timber. We just have to get more creative in the other solutions in order to reduce the cost of housing so we can get essentially more bang for our buck when we do raise that revenue.
Thank you. And I want to ask Dr. Mounah about this. You've talked a little bit, I know your expertise kind of includes talking about affordable housing, who gets it, where it goes. Like, you know, once the housing is developed, there's like this whole other question, or even finding out where it's developed, you know, with, you know, NIMBYism and the politics. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about like the social politics around these issues and kind of like how those get in the way and maybe how we could overcome them when it comes to addressing the affordability of housing.
Sure. Well, so when we think about affordable housing, there are a couple of issues that come to mind. First of all, affordable housing as a term is starting to become a little bit of an issue because some people look at it and say, oh, these are people that don't work or something along those lines. So that's one thing that we need to pay attention to. But we did like a study where we took 3 affordable housing units or complexes in San Diego and we looked at people's perception of them. And always the major obstacle for any development of affordable housing are crime, that basically having affordable housing is going to increase crime. And the second one is that affordable housing is going to reduce property value. And so we ask people that are around these 3 complexes all these questions, and none of this works. Like none of this is true. So basically property value is still increasing. Now there are different factors that lead to property value increase regardless, but also crime was not increasing in those neighborhoods. So the idea here is how can we get people to move away from those preconceived basically stereotypes that they have. The other interesting thing is that we have to work on is who is deserving of affordable housing. So when we ask people about a deserving population, you would see veterans score super high, seniors very high. You start asking them, okay, what if we house people who are previously experiencing homelessness, and that drops a lot. So the others would be like in the 60s or 70s or 80s. Then when we ask them, it drops to 45% of people that were indigenous. So how do we build becomes a clear issue. I am from the idea that we have to be creative. So we have to include the community in the construction of affordable housing in general. So when we think about single housing units, they have capacity to increase density. And so the idea is how can we innovate and bring people together so that they will intentionally build extra units. And I'm thinking about different perspectives. A lot of people think of ADUs that are out there, but we can think about garage conversions where we would add a ton of units super fast, increase values to people in their neighborhoods. So those are ideas that we can think about, and how do we do them or achieve them becomes an interesting issue.
Yeah, I want to expand on that a little bit. You see so many times in San Diego, we have these projects. I know recently I was reporting on like the tiny homes, and you bring the community into the conversation, you have the conversation, and then that in itself prevents these things from happening. And so I'm wondering, like, do you have any thoughts about how you can really get people to change their minds about this, or do you think it's gotten to the point where government officials just need to be like, you know what, get over it?
Yep.
Well, I think so. I totally agree about the need to build these affordable units for sure. I am more of a person who thinks like if we can create a win-win situation, that's the way to go, because you don't want to create a contentious environment in the neighborhood, although sometimes we have to build. But you know what? One interesting thing is sometimes we're building in the same neighborhoods over and over again, and some people are saying like, why aren't you building in other different neighborhoods? So this idea that even that people perceive that affordable housing is something negative and it needs to be separated into different neighborhoods, and that there is a problem with the perception about affordable housing. So this is where I think we need to create this idea about win-win, like how make it that the community will benefit from these affordable housing and people will benefit from it. And if we do that, I think we'll be successful.
Okay. And so we're talking a lot about policy, but I do want to shift a little bit and talk really about like the people that we're talking about. And I'm hoping, Brisa, that you can shine some light on this. We're talking about supporting the people who need the most support. Well, what does it look like on the ground for a lot of these workers when it comes to affording their basic needs? And what do you think it is that most people need on like an immediate basis in order to have the stability that we're, aiming for?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts.
Yeah, big question.
So I'm Brisa Johnson, director of the San Diego Black Worker Center, so I stay in my lane, y'all. I focus on workers, but I'm also a community member who has a mortgage that I can barely afford, right? I'm one of the people. And I think that goes into a lot about our narrative of how we're viewing affordable housing. And, I won't ask you to raise your hand, but be honest with yourself. When you think of affordable housing, you probably think of a single mother. You probably think of a person of color. You probably think Section 8. You probably think EBT. You probably have a lot of biases that go around who qualifies or who needs affordable housing. But the reality is, after the numbers we've just seen, is that if the median salary income for workers is $76,000, that's the average median. And an average house in San Diego is about $1 million. None of us can actually afford to buy a house. So we have to really start by changing the way we, as individuals, are even viewing affordable housing. Because I'm not going out and building affordable housing, are you? I can't do that. I wouldn't even know where to begin. Like, I'm gonna buy this lot and I'm gonna build affordable housing. I wouldn't know where to start. That's not something we can leave this room and start working on tomorrow, right? We still rely heavy on our leadership, our elected leaders to move these things. We rely on the government through local, state, and federal for these things. And ultimately what's happening is people who do have the money, who have the access, are using their affordability of it for greed and for profit, right? And so when we talk about like how the people are affected, we can easily go through the numbers of workers, right? And I can debunk every stereotype you have of low-wage jobs. But 1 in 3 Californians are working a low-wage job. And it's not just your fast food workers, it's not your retail stores, it's people who work in healthcare. It's educators. It's actually some engineers, the people who are manufacturing cars, they're low-wage workers. It's the janitors in hospitals who you rely on to clean that room so well so that your health stays intact, that are being paid $20 an hour, which is below any sort of livable income in San Diego. So I want us to use this time to also talk about kind of our own biases that we have when we think about the terms affordable housing and when we think about low-wage jobs, because low-wage jobs are not grunt work. It's not just, it's not what it used to be, right? Low-wage workers are essential jobs that used to be part of a middle-class growing economy that are now being paid below a livable wage in San Diego. So when we talk about the ability of workers, we also have to check our bias there as well, because we'll think of workers like, well, you need to work harder. You need to, get an education, get a college degree. Well, what we found in our research is that the working class now is more educated than they've ever been in the past 20 years. And actually, 1 of 3 people with a degree work a low-wage job, and 1 in 6 with a bachelor's degree also have a low-wage job. So this isn't are they qualified? They're more than qualified. They've done the work. They took the student loans out. You told us to take the loans out. That's what you said. We did it. We got the degree. You promised us we would get a job that we can afford, and we've been deferring our loans for 6 years because we can't afford to pay them back. And we're just trying to figure out if we can pay rent on time. And the other thing that when we're talking about workers, and we're talking about this affordable housing crisis, is it's really important, and it was mentioned here about being community-centered. But the other thing about being community-centered is also realizing that there's a burden that workers are carrying that is unspoken of. How can I go to advocacy meetings and be involved in city council and know what's on the agenda and the docket? And how can I come to the Voice of San Diego Summit? How can I come to these events? And I already am working, I'm in survival mode. I am working 2 jobs to pay a rent of $2,400 for less than 600 square footage, and I don't even have a parking spot at the end of my 2 shifts. I have to drive around the block multiple times. So the other thing is, we can't even politicize people in the ways that we need to get them involved into these issues because they're already overburdened, they're already overworked. And at the end of the day, people are not going to move unless it impacts their economics. And so when we are talking about affordable housing, or when we're talking about worker rights and advocacy for workers, how do we advocate for higher paying jobs? How do we advocate for healthcare benefits? How do we advocate for paid time off that includes sick time and maternity leave and vacation time and PTO? How do we advocate for these jobs in the spaces that we need to? And we need to realize that we have to impact their economics to do it. And whose economics do we have to impact? Everybody who is trying to make a profit off of our pain. Everybody who is trying to make profit off of our pain. And so that's what I want us to think about from a worker's perspective is I could easily sit here and give you a bunch of numbers. And if you want the data, I got you. But I want us to be really important that the low-wage workers that are suffering the most in this economy are no longer just the minimum wage jobs. It's people like you and me in this room who, if we're being honest with ourselves, things are so much tighter than they used to be. I make what San Diego would classify as a livable wage, and yet 50% of my pay goes to housing. One whole paycheck, the first paycheck, goes completely to my mortgage, which means the paycheck on the 15th now has to cover everything else, and it has to be budgeted. And I see a lot of head nods right now, which means this is the average struggle of most San Diegans. So let's start having conversations around affordable housing. Let's start having conversations around worker advocacy and worker rights and a livable wage when we're demanding increase in minimum wage. Let's stop thinking that we're so far removed from it, because we're actually the ones that are probably closer to being unsheltered than we are closer to being millionaires.
Thank you for that. I want to ask, I'm hoping that you can answer this one, but also Ray, if you could jump in afterwards. We're talking about these people who we know we need in our communities who can't really afford to be here, but they are here. And we're talking about like teachers, healthcare workers, people who are working in grocery stores, making wages that, cannot actually make ends meet in San Diego. So I'm wondering, how are we seeing that manifest in our communities? And also just thinking about the fact that I don't imagine that these are the people who are part of this California exodus. In order to leave, to better your situation, you have to have money to leave. So, yeah, those are just some thoughts. But do you have any thoughts on that, Brisa?
Yeah, I mean, one of the major things is, and I hate to be this girly, but it comes back to my organizing roots, is unions. Unions off top make 10% more than a non-union worker for that same field of work, thanks to collective bargaining agreements. Collective bargaining agreements are basically within the name. It's when a collective comes together to bargain their rights and bargains their pay. For all my, do we have parents in the room? All right. I always tell this to when I work with younger kids. I give them the analogy of Bug's Life. It's a Disney movie. And in Bug's Life, the grasshoppers convince these little bit of ants that they're bigger than them and they're better than them and stronger than them because physically they are. And what the ants realize at the end is that when they come together with all 1,000 of the ants, they actually trump these 10 grasshoppers. And that to me is the best way to describe collective bargaining. It's just this gathering of more people power and having people that can really advocate and put people power at the center and the masses so that you can advocate for these higher paying jobs. So being a part of a union, especially if there is a union for your field of work, is so crucial to guaranteeing a higher pay, and not only a higher pay, but worker rights protections, such as making sure that your rights aren't violated on the job, making sure that you aren't dealing with any wage theft, right? Making sure that you aren't having to pay out of pocket for your equipment, because that's also illegal. Making sure that they are providing you with all the needs you need for your job, in addition to making sure that you have paid time off, paid sick days, and access to quality health care. The other thing is really addressing the wage theft crisis that is happening in California, and specifically here in San Diego. There's $2 billion worth of stolen wages in California alone, just on minimum wage violations alone. And people don't even realize that they're impacted by wage theft because they think of it as, I'm just being denied my hourly pay. And they don't realize that wage theft is also being denied breaks. It's also being denied overtime pay. It's also arriving to your job for your shift and then being told to go home because it's slow and there are already too many staff, and then them not paying you for at least half a day, because that's what they're required if you showed up for a shift, right? So it's one, educating people about their rights on the job as a worker, but then also making sure that we're going after and amplifying policy that addresses these issues like wage theft, making sure that here in San Diego, when wage theft claims are filed, people can't get pulled out, because as of now, paid out. Because as of now in San Diego, only 4% of wage theft claims that have been filed have been paid in full, and 96% of the other cases remain unknown. So it's making sure that when we are breaking down worker advocacy, we're looking at it from a worker rights perspective, because if you know your rights are being violated, then most likely your pay is also being withheld.
All right, I want to hand it over to Ray, and just to be more specific, I'm trying to figure out who is leaving San Diego, who has the means to leave, and how does that affect the San Diego of the future, both demographically and economically?
Well, this is the first time in history that we've actually seen an exodus from San Diego in terms of population. Even during the Great Recession in 2008, people would rather take a job that they needed to travel to, like even as far away as Chicago, but they wanted to keep their family intact in San Diego, kids in the school system that they were in, and they would rather travel than move from the region, but that was because they could afford to live here. In the last 20 years, a lot has changed in terms of affordability, and the incomes have not kept up with costs, but the thing, you can flip that around and say that the costs have increased much faster than wages have. But right now, if you graduate from college right now and you want to take an entry-level job almost anywhere, and you can, government, it doesn't matter, you are probably not going to be able to afford a house. 20 years ago, you could have done that, especially if you had a partner and you decide you want to buy a house, that's the first thing you do. Then you can no longer do that. That dynamic is not here. So the people who are moving are people who are either college graduates who have finished their college and they're looking for a job and they realize that this is not the place where they're going to be able to have a future, so they start looking elsewhere. You have people who are retired, who are older, who just cannot continue to pay the increase in gas and taxes and insurance, and especially if you live in East County and it's less affordable housing, your property, your insurance costs have doubled or tripled in the last couple of years because of wildfires, for instance. So the unaffordability of living in San Diego is forcing older people out too, who no longer have an ability to, for instance, increase their wages. There's some remote workers who've been able to leave, so that's happening too. But I think part of what you're also seeing is that you're not seeing as many people move into San Diego for job opportunities as they did in the past. In the past, people would come here, and businesses have an incredible problem right now trying to hire people from out of state, because they just can't make the numbers work and bring their family here and find a house and work the job. And so you're seeing that demographic shift also. But I think if this situation doesn't solve itself relatively soon, I think those people who are in industries where there are job centers outside of San Diego, like for instance there are high-tech centers elsewhere throughout the nation, that those people will start to consider leaving this particular region until the cost gets back into balance with what the wages are in this region.
And so I want to throw it back to you and just trying to figure out, how do we make San Diego a place of greater economic opportunity for people, and attracting those industries that would provide more moderate or high-paying jobs? Or anybody.
Well,
really.
one of the things that has to be done is we need to rethink where the center of this region is. It's not downtown San Diego. The jobs are really created in Serrano Valley, and the other high-paying jobs are created in the Palomar Airport Road area, for instance. And you need to look at where those high-paying jobs are. And the reason that I'm saying that is that we need to provide infrastructure and housing close to those areas. If you're a business and you want to open, you're in Serrano Valley, your employees don't have anywhere that they can live. They have to travel long distances, which is against all of the VMT and GHG and climate action things that we're trying to do. You have to travel the longest distance for a job. So Serrano Valley actually has the longest commute of any employment center in San Diego, because that's where the high-paying jobs are, and people commute from distances. So really rethinking what drives the San Diego region, which really in the future, if you look at what's happening, it has to be high-tech. It's not going to be the tourism industry, as much as that is, it is big here in San Diego. It's low-paying jobs. We have to create the higher-paying jobs. It's going to be around things like artificial intelligence, around drone technology, around data analytics. Those are the jobs of the future. Okay, that's what's going to drive the economy. So where those jobs are centered, that's where we need to concentrate on building housing so that people can have these jobs. And the reason you need the housing there is so that the businesses can hire people and say, yeah, you can live 3 miles away or 5 miles away, or there's a bus that you can catch and come over here. We can't do that right now in the areas where we have most of our economic GDP being created.
Interesting. Okay. I want to get into talking about some of the immediate housing needs. We're talking a lot about the future, but there's a lot of people who are facing potential homelessness right now. And I'm wondering, what do we think, and this could go for Asad or Dr. Mounah, but in terms of addressing people's immediate housing needs today, like what could the government do to, as our theme says, meet the moment? Is it just giving people money? What does that look like?
So, if we're gonna build housing, it's gonna take a while to build housing. And so that's something we all know. And so as we're striving for these extra 100,000 units, we need to think about tools that we can use now, immediately, in order to help people stay housed. So we did this research and where we interviewed around 200 somewhat people from like 4 zip codes in San Diego. And these are zip codes where people have been calling 211 asking for assistance, whether it's rental assistance or mainly utility assistance. And one of the things that we have found out when we ask people that, do you feel you're going to become unhoused in the near future? And 49% of the people said yes. And so that's a huge number. So we have and we see this like a time bomb on our hand, because we're seeing even now, if you look at the number of people who are falling into homelessness versus the people that are being taken off the streets, we see the numbers sometimes change depending on when they send us the information, 13 to 10, 13 to 9, something like that. And so the question is, how can we change that and how can we work to improve it, like keep people housed? One tool that's available out there is utility assistance. So for example, people could apply to SDG&E for different programs. One is called CARE, one is called FERA. So those are things that are helping people. And what we need to do is double down on those. So now currently you can get 30% if you're on CARE, which is basically if you are on Medicaid or if you're on SNAP, so you can do that. But 30% is not allowing enough people, it's not giving them enough of a cushion. But this is an important tool that we can use to keep people in house, because if they're not paying for their utility assistance, they're at least using that to pay for food, to pay for rent, to pay for any different things. And so I could go on and on about this more, because we can easily change it. And that's a combination of a public monopoly, the public-private monopoly, if you want to think about SDG&E to a certain extent, that could put more, which they should, because they're making so much profit, but who am I to tell them not to make profit? And that's one. And our, of course, government and could subsidize as well. So we have these tools. The reason why this is an important one, in my opinion, is that there is a lot of negative feeling that is out there when people hand money directly to other people. And it's like, it's always this. It would be like, oh, you give them the money, they're gonna use it to buy drugs. They're gonna use it to buy alcohol, isn't it? We hear that a lot of time. So how can we do, and sometimes we don't, which would be great, Like, how can we make sure to give people something that basically sidestep all these negative stereotypes? Utility assistance is one example of those tools. And we can add other tools, doesn't have to be the only one. But at least then we stabilize the people in their places instead of having to see them on the streets and then having to do the whole process again, which is very costly and very traumatic for people that will end up on the street to re-enter into these housing units. So at least these are some ideas.
All right, Saad, and to repeat the question, just what can we do to address housing instability near term?
So one of the most effective ways to just prevent people from going into homelessness is that gap, essentially, that you're often unable to make rent that month, and if you don't make rent that month, you fall into homelessness, and it's harder and harder to get back out of it. You have to find a security deposit, etc. So having rental assistance programs, especially emergency rental assistance programs, is really helpful for preventing people from falling into housing instability. Of course, that requires money, and that is always competing for so many other things at the city level. Like, it's just this year, the city of San Diego took money from the affordable housing budget to pay for the homeless shelter budget. So we're just kind of, I think the San Diego Housing Commissioner put it quite frankly, just we're often taking money to, we're selling the tire to pay for gas. So the situation is dire, but the money is a critical part of it. Having that rental assistance is short term, or rather helps people today. We also need to be building affordable housing, putting the money into it. Again, that's why we need to have dedicated revenue for it. Other cities in California have that. And then also, we have to build supply, we have to build more homes. That does take long term, but they're building today, and we can create affordable homes. There's a program within the city of San Diego and in other cities across the state, basically density bonus. If the developer builds more, builds a larger building essentially, and some of those units, some of those homes are restricted to affordable units, meaning that they're reserved for low-income households, they're allowed to build larger buildings. And so that's been one of the easiest and effective tools to build affordable housing now. You're essentially having the developers pay for it. They get the bonus of being able to build more homes. And we also get the bonus of just having more homes in our urban communities, so people have shorter commutes. So I think it's a win-win from a climate, affordability, and often equity perspective, because these buildings are going up. And there's one, for example, that went up near where I live in Mission Hills that has affordable homes in an area that's often very, very expensive. So those are the three areas, is that rental assistance, affordable housing bonds, affordable housing money, and then also these bonus programs that put the budget on developers to pay for some of the affordable housing, but they still win because they're able to build more homes in overall.
All right, I want to ask a little bit of a philosophical question before jumping over to some of these audience questions, and anybody can jump at this. My question is, how do we get people to care about the future, particularly when the current situation is so dire? I get a lot of the screw the kids mentality from people. But yeah, any thoughts on that?
So 2 things. I've been in social justice now for 12 years. And something that I learned early on in my optimism coming out of political science, that I wanted to be the change I want to see. That's what they used to tell you, and I used to really believe it to my core. People don't care. They don't. And that's okay, because I'm not here, especially, as a Black woman, I hate to break it to y'all, but I deal with racism every now and then. And it was a joke, y'all can laugh, it's okay. They're like, we're not sure, hold on. Something that I've learned is I'm not here to convince people not to be racist. I'm not here to convince people not to be sexist. I'm not here to convince people to care about the unsheltered community. I'm going to find ways that are going to force you to do what's right because it makes you uncomfortable. Not because it's a moral issue. It is a moral issue, but I can't convince you that it's a moral issue. So what I could do is get involved in boycotts. I get involved in strikes. I can figure out ways to impact your finances. If it's a company, if it's a specific sector of work, right? If it's a specific elected official, right? There's things I can do that I know you want money from this organization. And I know that this organization values their membership. So if I can organize the membership to rally the union leader to say, hey, or the organization or the company, hey, don't make a donation or don't sponsor, don't support, or you're gonna lose our vote, or you're gonna lose our membership. If I can figure out what the pressure is to convince you to do the right thing, then that has to be the strategy. Because I could spend all day talking to you on how it is immoral and hurtful to continue to criminalize the unsheltered community, to continue to just push them into other neighborhoods because they're in your way. Or when we want to build some affordable housing, or we want to build a shelter for them, you say, not in my backyard, not in our neighborhood, do it somewhere else. You're gonna always have these kind of thoughts or bias because we as Americans, including myself, we feel a little entitled sometimes. And so to me, it's not trying to convince people to care anymore. Again, I've been in the game a long time, so I'm a little jaded. But it's not about convincing people to care in my mind. It's about finding the strategy that's gonna force them to do the right thing. Because they have the data. They have all the numbers, they have it all. I can't tell you how many times we've gone to the lobby visits, and especially with new organizers and activists, and they're like, 1 of 3 people are suffering and they're nervous and they're scared, or they're passionate and they're fierce and they're fire, and they hit them with the data and everything. And the lobbyist just says, okay, thank you for your time, and closes their little notebook and goes about their day. They have the numbers, they have the data, they see it, but they profit from it, and they benefit from it. They benefit from our suffering. And that's why collective power is important. That's why people power is important. That's why these gatherings are important, because it takes us a moment to come together to say, what is my role in activism? What is my role in the affordability crisis? What is my role in worker justice? What's my role in the unsheltered community? Because all of us have one. And I think that has to be kind of the focus, as opposed to trying to convince people to care.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
But please care. Care too.
I could try. I'm not
Go
promising
for it,
that
yeah.
this would work. Let me get off social media. Everyone is living in their own bubble, and over time, everyone thinks everything is going down the drain, and the country is going to hell. Like, that's what we feel if you watch social media. Listen, this is not true. We live still in an excellent place. Like, we still have running water. It's perfect. Other people are not having running water. We can drink from tap. That's a wonderful thing. Other people can't. Other people might be bombed. We're not being bombed. Like, we live in a good place that we just need to focus on how do we make it better. And so social media is keeping us in these bubbles, and everyone is so scared that something is happening at a time when it's not true. If we could do that, then we have room in our heart to have empathy. Like, we have lost empathy. Like 10 years ago, not totally, not everyone, I'm just saying in general, there is a gen. But 10 years ago, everyone cares about their house. Everyone was caring. We really thought, oh, we need to put more resources. We need to do more. And I do blame here a little bit, not totally, but the public sector, which I love, by the way, did not deliver enough in the speed that we wanted them to deliver. And so everyone was like, okay, this is not working. Let's move all the unhoused out of our face because that's not gonna work. And you have seen it on the news, isn't it? That's what started happening. But that's because we continuously bombarded that there's nothing happening, even though they were housing a lot of people, but the problem we were not dealing with the preventative tools to stop it from continuing. So the question is, in my opinion, not the question is, like, my idea here is that we need to leave room for empathy and then use that empathy in order to galvanize around important issues and then move forward with it and keep pressuring these public official to make the right decision. Because at the end of the day, if we don't pressure them, they're not gonna make it. That's how politics or democracy works. And so we have to keep working over and over. And I agree with Brisa on a lot of the things that she mentioned, and those are super important as well.
Yeah, social media is a very bad place. Okay, well, I'm going to take a second to introduce our Aaron Price Fellow. They're gonna kick off the audience questions. I'm sure you've heard a lot about these folks today. Very talented and smart group of students who are going through this program, and there are a bunch of them here that ask questions. Go take the mic and introduce yourself, please.
Okay, so thank you for that introduction. My name is Hannah Sandoval. I'm a junior at University City High School. And my question is, what are the ways to improve a community without gentrifying, and how does gentrification play a role in the affordability crisis?
Anybody?
Okay, first off, I want to make it clear that it's possible, okay? It is totally possible to revitalize and invest in a community without gentrifying it. First things first, you have to be community-centered and community-led. I cannot tell you how many times I've been in a room of advocacy where people wanted to do a homeless initiative and not anybody in that room had ever been homeless. Crazy. I can't tell you how many times I've been in rooms with people trying to figure out what's a good worker policy and to put in the employee handbook that includes some intersectional lens and language that's inclusive, and not a single worker in the room. And let alone, let's not even talk about if there was diversity in the room, right? So I think it's so important when we're talking about building these initiatives, you have got to have people from the community in the room. The people who have lived in that neighborhood for generations, people whose families have lived in that community. You have to have people who function in that community on a daily basis. We have to start valuing the minds of people who may not have a fancy title. A lot of us get into these doors because we can't wait to say, well, I'm the director of so-and-so, and I'm the CEO. And then that somehow qualifies them to make these decisions on community's behalf, but they're not qualified. They don't live in these neighborhoods. They don't live that experience. It's not their story to tell. So first things first, if you're doing any building in any neighborhood, it has to be with community at the center. It has to be community-led. And secondly, when you're building policies specifically around development, you have got to have equitable policies and language in that. And when we're talking about equity, we're not talking about equal, right? We're acknowledging the fact that you have more and they have less. So how do we balance the scale? How do we make it equitable, right? So if we already know that, okay, we want to move into this neighborhood and it's most likely we want to build these businesses and it might displace these people. Instead of displacing them, how do we guarantee them jobs in this facility? How do we guarantee that the people in this neighborhood are benefiting financially in some way from this development? How do we say, okay, the income or the profit that we make is going to go back into infrastructure. We're going to fix these streets. What are the streets that need the most work? Can the community tell us, right? We have to just be inclusive and care about people and stop moving in a space of profit and greed. And that's why gentrification is so prevalent, because people are constantly thinking about the dollar and not thinking about the generations of people that they're now displacing. And also investing into Black and brown businesses. The problem with gentrification is you end up putting out businesses that have been there for 20, 30 years. And no, it's not a multi-million-dollar business, but it's the place that all of us have been going to for our bread for years. And we love it, and they know our name, and they know us. And we love supporting, because we know Abuelita is in the back making the bread herself. And that's why we love it. It's family. It's people who came and made a way. It's the fabrics of how United States is who we are. And we're so quick to throw that out for a high rise. And we have to value that. If we don't value it, then we at least need to find a compromise. But that's how you build and avoid gentrification. You keep the people at the center. You stop making decisions behind closed doors. You want public opinion for decisions you're making behind closed doors. That's not okay. Let's stop having private conversations about public things.
All right. I'm gonna go into the first audience question. I haven't specifically asked about home ownership. We've talked a lot about homes, but not this specifically. Somebody asked, Do you have any thoughts about how local governments can make home ownership more affordable for workers like public safety workers, teachers, nurses, military, and government employees? Yeah, buying a home.
So one of the traditional forms of home ownership that used to exist but are increasingly out of existence are condos. So in the early 2000s and in the 90s, there were a lot of condos, but we passed some good consumer protection laws in 2007. But those consumer protection laws perhaps balanced it a little bit too much in a way that resulted in people just not building more condos. So we need to reform some of those laws while still maintaining consumer protection. Canada is not a nation known for being some free market, crazy wazoo land, but they have still producing tons of condos while still maintaining consumer protection for the people. So if there's any defect, people can still sue the developers, but right now it's essentially moved in a way so that there's too much fear that they'll get sued, so they don't even bother to build. So that's one area, is just creating those home ownership opportunities that are smaller, those starter homes. Don't necessarily need someone to expect to immediately jump into a 4-bedroom house, where those like 1 to 2 bedroom home ownership opportunities, and increasing those home ownership opportunities. Most of the units we're building right now are for rent. And so we need to reform those laws to make it easier for people to buy those homes. And of course, there's down payment assistance programs. We still need to have that. But again, there's just so little money we're just competing for so much money at this point. It's like we can put money in the down payment home assistance program. Does that now mean we have less money in our affordable housing programs, less money for shelters, less money for libraries and parks? We can raise revenue, we have sales tax measures on there, but that's also kind of difficult to get people on board with that. So I'm all for putting money into these programs, but we also need to find ways to just increase the options for home ownership, and that could be smaller homes. Don't need to have everyone imagine a big house as the initial part.
I just bought a home 2 years ago. So my interest rate 6.25, y'all. It hurts. It really hurts. But here's 2 things that really helped me, and my real estate agent told me this, and it was so helpful. One was get out the family, like the single family home. Get it out your head. Like, get in the market. Like, get in the market, make the sacrifice now, and remember that your first home is not going to be your forever home. So if it's a condo that you buy first, if it's a 1-bedroom that you buy first, if you're lucky enough to get a townhouse, like, be okay with just getting in the market and accepting that this is not your forever home. The second thing is, even with the initiatives, even with down payment assistance, there is no way to buy a home if you do not have hard cash. There isn't. And there's no way to buy a home if you can't track where that cash came from. So if you have the privilege of having family in San Diego, your best bet, I'm not even kidding you, is to move home. It is to move home and try to save as much as you can, because even with the assistance, once you start adding closing costs and property taxes, you have to have cash, and they need to know where it came from. It has to be tracked. So it has to be from like a direct deposit. It has to be either like a family show that it came from a family account. I'm so serious. So that's just like 2 like real life tips, because I own a home as a single woman. I'm not married. I bought it myself in San Diego, and I got 2 kids. Ain't no way I'd be able to do that if it wasn't for those 2 things. So for someone who's really serious about like going down that route, you got to find a way to save money. And if it means living home and making that sacrifice, or sleeping on someone's couch for 6 months and putting that $2,700 you were paying on rent every month into an account, then that's what you got to do. It's a small sacrifice for a longer gain.
Yeah, so follow up on that. I went from being almost an empty nester to having my 3 kids living with me again. I don't know if that's if you're saving for a house or not, but yeah, I have to go home and check. I think this is a supply and demand issue, speaking as an economist, and the problem is that there's more demand than there is supply, and the supply that is out there is really being gobbled up by institutional buyers rather than single family homeowners, okay? Yep. And so that's really where if the government is going to intervene, it should intervene there and on things like Airbnbs. Because if you look at the number of units that have been taken off of the market and are there as rental homes, and I get it. I mean, people are using it to profit themselves. And I don't have any objection to somebody having a second home that they're renting out. But it's when you start to make a business out of it and you buy 10 homes that are now that are seasonal, okay, and that displaces 10 San Diego families that could be living there, and you're now competing with the hotel motel industry. That needs to be addressed, but really the institutional purchases of these homes needs to be addressed too, because that's really where the problem is. The single family home should be for single family people, and not businesses. And if you did that, I think you could free up enough units that a lot of this pent up demand would be taken care of.
All right, I'm gonna ask a question now that maybe will instill hope, hopefully, let's see. What are the biggest obstacles and caveat, the most solvable obstacles to improving the housing situation in San Diego right now? Low-hanging fruit.
Voting. I mean, I don't want to be cliche, but voting down the ballot. And I want to make sure that I emphasize voting down the ballot. You know, I love, it's a presidential year, so, everybody comes in game 7. That's what this is. Everyone's like, you got to vote. Where you been for the last 4 years? We've had a lot of other elections. The presidential election is important, yes. Your local and state is so much more important. It really is. And really, like, when people say something, fact check it. Like when Mayor Todd Gloria says, I've done A, B, C, and D, go see if he's really done A, B, C, and D. Like, really look it up and hold the fire to our elected leaders. We have a lot of elected leaders who unfortunately win elections off promising you better paying jobs and addressing the affordable housing crisis. It is like the main platform of most elected leaders. And in addition, most of the time in office, they are being strategic in their next steps. They are like, this is the office I'm trying to get to, and I need to keep appeasing to these donors and these supporters because these are the ones that are gonna push my agenda and move me up. But I gotta make some promises to them too to get those spaces, which means I'm gonna entertain the community's needs, but in the process, I've already made a deal behind closed doors because I'm trying to get to the Senate. That's the reality of the game, y'all. And so once you accept that reality, you can start holding electeds better because we do lead better leadership. And back to our panelist point about bringing humanity back and caring, like, we need people in office who do care about humanity, who do care about the issues, who do have empathy. And it's okay to say you are not serving the community and the people, and therefore you don't deserve our vote. And therefore you don't deserve to be involved. It's also knowing about the propositions. It's knowing about the local measures. It's also knowing who's on the housing commission. Who's the city attorney, right? It's knowing those things and voting down the ballot that is going to have you're gonna feel that before you feel whoever the president is.
Well, I think this is a really common question that's been coming up a lot since COVID, but there's a lot of vacant commercial and retail spaces out there, vacant office spaces, and this person is wondering, could cities rezone and or use eminent domain to use these properties to build high or medium density housing? Talking about office buildings, commercial buildings.
Tearing down the buildings and putting housing, or trying to convert office buildings to housing?
Either of those things.
Yeah, so the conversion is not as easy. If people have looked at this, it's not as easy as you think, and a lot of it has to do with the plumbing. If you think about an office building, there's a central core with a restroom in it, and if you tried to turn this into housing where you needed to have showers and kitchens and garbage disposals, the infrastructure of that building is not built for housing. The retrofitting of those commercial buildings is actually more expensive in most cases than building new somewhere else. And so if you're really looking at building or solving the problem, you have to figure out a way how to how to build quickly. And a lot of that is government red tape we have got to get rid of to build the units quickly, but the conversions is just unfortunately not really a good option.
Do you have anything to add to that?
No,
You did the thing, okay. And Saad, you kind of touched on this a little bit, and maybe you can expand on it, but this person is asking about Prop 5, which would lower the voting barrier for infrastructure projects, taxes or bonds to support infrastructure projects. And if this does pass, how could this potentially make housing more affordable, increase supply? Could you just expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Proposition 5, so maybe let me sit through the background. In order to raise funds, local governments often issue bonds, which is essentially debt that they then sell, and then they get this revenue stream from selling it to investors. Many of those investors are like employee pension funds, government pension funds, so it's kind of sometimes the government is funding the government in other ways. But the idea is that local governments will issue bonds. We're relatively familiar with this with school bonds. Those are the ones that you probably hear about the most. But another way we can actually increase housing is by having housing bonds that will allow us to have a revenue stream to build and pay for affordable housing. So Proposition 5 would lower the threshold. Right now, in order to have those bonds pass, you have to have 2/3 of the vote, or a supermajority of the vote. San Diego, I believe, did this a few years ago, and it was only about 65% or something like that, and so it didn't pass. Prop 5 would lower the threshold to 55%, so a smaller threshold of people would be able to vote. It still has to be more than a majority, 55%, and it would allow us to issue bonds at a much more feasible, just a feasible threshold. It's very hard to pass anything with a supermajority in any form of legislature. So lowering it to 55% would allow us to potentially issue affordable housing bonds and increase the construction of that. With that said, I mean, the state has issued tons of money for affordable housing, so I don't want to make that seem like that's the only solution. We need to lower the cost. We need to, as Ray said, there are lots of barriers, regulatory barriers, restrictions. I think the one thing I should say as a YIMBY is that 80% of San Diego's land essentially only allows for single unit homes, single unit detached homes. So you can build a duplex, a fourplex, a small, sixplex or something like that on those areas. So those are some of the restrictions that limit us from building more. So yes, we need to have those affordable housing bonds. Prop 5 is a way to help us get there, but we must continue to reduce those barriers so we can build cheaper and make better use of those affordable housing bonds.
All right, and on the topic of the propositions, this is going to be our last question, and I know there was a whole panel on this, so sorry if this is redundant for anybody who's in that panel, but I wanted to ask about Prop 33 and rent control. Do we see this as something that could help the situation or hurt? Prop 33, do you support it?
Rent control really doesn't help the situation. It creates a whole other set of problems in the long run. The fundamental problem needs to be solved. I mean, and it's something that we didn't quite mention, but Brisa talked about it. Her interest rate is at 6.25%. If her interest rate went back to what it was pre-COVID, instead of spending one paycheck, every other paycheck going to rent, it'd be 1 week's work. She'd have to work 1 week to afford the exact same house. That's how much impact the interest rates have on affordability. And that's really the problem, is like we've doubled the cost of housing in the last couple of years, and we're trying to solve it with all sorts of other mechanisms. So I really think we need to attack the problem and really, I mean, I know it's not a local problem, but that's really what's keeping people from being able to afford housing.
So I think rent control can have some okay designs that will help people stay in their apartments longer. I think when you have really restrictive rent control, then people are just deterred from building homes. Unfortunately, we live in a capitalist society, so we rely on some of these developers to build those homes if the government isn't building them. So we still need some of that incentive for them to make money. So if the rent control is designed in a way that allows people to have returns and it's still allowing us to build those homes, that's critical. So it all kind of depends on the design. I think what I'm most concerned about with Prop 33 is there are a lot of NIMBY cities, Huntington Beach being an example of a city that said they will purposefully enact rent control to make it impossible to build new homes in Huntington Beach. They want to misuse the law to protect people and just use it in a way as to just kick people out. And so that's what's going to happen in a lot of these wealthy beach cities. They're going to use rent control to say, hey, we solved the problem, we put in rent control, while they haven't built a single unit of affordable housing in the past decade. So that's my biggest fear, is that we enact rent control and act like we've solved something and give these local governments control when they failed to continue to deliver year after year. So if the state wants into it, set a heavy hand, but I don't want to let any NIMBY cities take control and pretend like they've solved their issues.
I definitely want to read Prop 33 because it's a lot of smoke and mirrors. I think the language in Prop 33 is problematic. So it's not something I personally would support, but I want you to do your research and see if it's something that you also wouldn't support. I think the concept of rent control is important though. I think the concept of what rent control was designed to do, which was to prevent landlords from taking advantage of renters and taking advantage of working class families, right? And so I think we have to be careful though when people tack rent control onto propositions and really make sure that we're diving deeper into the language in the bills, because it's not always what it was created to be. So I just wanted to share that rent control in theory is really great because it's a form of protection against landlords that do take advantage of the system. However, there are a lot of people who are throwing rent control in with also blocking the attempt to build any new housing, which is going to be problematic. And as you've heard on this panel, we want our houses to be affordable and we want our wages to go up. Thanks for coming to our TED Talk.
Yeah, don't even get me started on the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. If you know, you know. If you don't know, I explained it on the podcast this last week, or 2 weeks ago, I don't know. Lots of research to be done, and I'm sure you guys are all the kinds of people who will do that. So have fun. Thank you guys all for coming. A round of applause for our panelists.
Thank you so much for joining us. The next session starts at 4:30. It's actually our keynote speaker. It's in the theater. Help us spread the word by sharing our website, voiceofsandiego.org. And if you've enjoyed today's session, sign up for our weekly newsletters at voiceofsandiego.org/newsletters. Thanks again to our sponsors and our wonderful volunteers.
Well, you know someone who knows the work class. Has to be with them sometimes.